If you just logged on, we are going to get started in 2 minutes, just waiting for the rest of our registered participants to join. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for waiting those couple of minutes. I think we have most people logged on now. So welcome again. My name is Erica Wood. I'm the Mystic River Watershed Association's Communications and Outreach Manager, and I also manage our invasive plants removal program in partnership with our watershed scientist, Andy Racina. So today I'm going to be talking to you about invasive plants, what they are, why they are bad, what the Mystic River Watershed Association is doing to combat invasive plants, and how you can get involved. But first, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping things with Zoom. In case you have not been on a webinar before, the webinar format actually automatically mutes all participants and your video will not work. So if you were confused about that, don't be worried. You should only see my video and the screen that I am sharing. At the end, I will have time for question and answer. So you should see at the bottom of your screen a little toolbar with a Q&A button. If you type your questions into there, at the end I'll be able to see all of those. There's also a chat function. You can type things into the chat box, but as the conversation goes on throughout the webinar, it's easy for questions or comments to get lost. So I would really recommend using that Q&A box if you have a question that you definitely want me to see at the end to make sure that I can get to it. So without further ado, I will go ahead and begin. So our agenda today, I'm going to talk to you briefly about the Mystic River Watershed Association. And then, as I mentioned, we will go over the concept of invasive plants, identifying, explaining that term, and learning more about what our organization is doing to tackle this problem in our watershed. We will also discuss Oriental bittersweet, how to ID it, how to remove it, and how to get involved with MYAWA's removal program. So for anyone who is new to the Mystic River watershed, this outline here identifies our entire watershed, which is comprised of 21 communities and 77 square miles. Our organization works to protect and restore both the river, but also the watershed lands, the parks and paths around the river. And we do that for people, both current and future, but also for wildlife. And we do that in several different ways, whether it's designing and advocating for greenways along the river so that people have access to waterfront spaces, to safe and beautified parks, and also to active transportation to get up and down the river corridor. We also work on science programs to improve water quality, to monitor the river herring that migrate up and down the river each spring. We facilitate a regional climate collaborative and are working on ways to increase our watershed's climate resiliency and social resiliency. And we also connect people to the mystic, so really trying to showcase all of the natural resources that are in our backyard and how to access them. So now we're getting into the meat of the program today. So what are invasive plants? Well, invasives are plants that are non-native. They thrive in the local ecosystem, but they do so at the detriment of the local ecosystem. So this photo here, you can see in the back, shows lily pads, but in the front, closest to us, you see these plants that are, they have little diamond-shaped leaves and rosettes. These are water chestnut, which I will talk more about later, but these are one of the plants that are invasive in the Mystic River watershed and in watersheds near us. So, water chestnut is just one example of a plant that is not native to here, but does really well, and it does so at the detriment of native plants and wildlife. Now, there are some plants that are non-native, but are not considered invasive. For instance, this is a photo of Queen Anne's lace, and this flower actually is not native to here. It's a European plant, but it actually blends relatively well with our native flowers, and it does support native pollinators to an extent. So it is not considered invasive because it doesn't have any detrimental effect on our environment or ecosystems. But why are native plants better? I alluded to this a little bit in talking about Queen Anne's lace, but native plants are the ones that support our ecosystems. Similarly with native wildlife or native insects, anything that is native to an environment or natural is going to support the food system and the ecosystem in that space. Alternatively, invasive plants won't support that native wildlife, and oftentimes, not only do they not support native wildlife or insects, but they also actively degrade those ecosystems. So this is just one example. You'll see the oak tree is really the base of this food system in this graphic, and it supports an abundance of life. This is just another example of how trees, which I will talk about momentarily too in regards to native plants, are supporting an ecosystem. And here are specific examples. So a native oak tree, oaks are native to America. This tree will support more than 500 native moths and butterflies, which are important to the food web for feeding larger wildlife. However, a Norway maple, which is very common here, it is invasive, supports 0 moths and butterflies. So to our food system, or to pollinators, a Norway maple is a food desert, whereas a native oak is a feast. So we really like these native plants. We really dislike invasive plants because they disrupt the food web. They disrupt the ecosystem. So the Mystic River Watershed Association has been working to combat invasive plants since 2010. And these are just some of these stats from last year's invasive plant removal program. You can see here, we worked with over 1,500 volunteers. We removed a lot of water chestnut, 1,000 bags of Oriental bittersweet. So we're really working to mobilize citizen scientists, volunteers to reduce this problem. We also work with municipalities and corporate organizations and community groups to do this work and partner with the state and municipalities to contract a mechanical harvester each year to remove water chestnut from the river. So now I will go into some basics about water chestnut and then Oriental bittersweet. So water chestnut, as I mentioned, and I showed a photo at the very beginning, this plant is not native to America or to New England. It is an aquatic plant. It has a submerged stem and is comprised of diamond-shaped leaves that form a rosette. They also have these very unique looking seed pods that are very sharp, and they're easily identifiable when you're out on the water. Here again is a photo of water chestnut. But why is it so bad besides not supporting wildlife in the food web? In addition to that, water chestnut spreads really quickly over the river. It forms dense mats of plant matter, and it limits light so that our aquatic ecosystems are impaired. It also reduces oxygen as the plant decomposes at the end of the season, which is bad for our fish populations. It competes with native vegetation, so again, it's not benefiting any wildlife in the food web that feeds off of native vegetation. And for people, it really limits our ability to boat, fish, or swim on the river. This photo showcases a mechanical harvester. So this machine will be out in the deeper parts of the Mystic River actively removing water chestnut, and our volunteers are typically deployed in boats in the shallower sections of the river to go where this mechanical harvester cannot. We began eradication efforts in 2010, and mechanical harvesting started in 2011. And I just love this photo, or series of photos. It shows what water chestnut volumes look like at the beginning of a season and then at the end after a combination of mechanical harvesting and volunteer efforts for removal. So this is really what we like to see in terms of impact from our removal programs. I mentioned volunteers are deployed in boats to remove water chestnut. So this is, in a typical season, how we are working to remove water chestnut from the river. Unfortunately, because we cannot deploy volunteers in person this year or work in large groups due to COVID-19, we will be working with a small team of interns to remove water chestnut and concentrating really on single plants or small patches to try to prevent those from turning into large patches next season. Now I'll move on to Oriental bittersweet. So we began this program in 2017, and this involves deploying volunteers to parks to remove a land-based invasive plant. And this plant, in addition to not supporting native wildlife, is terrible for trees. This is one of the reasons that we really do not like this plant, and we focus on removing it from our green spaces. So you can see here, this is a photo from last year with a volunteer group, and the bittersweet has just taken over that tree. It is not a weeping willow. That is actually a tree that was presumably killed from bittersweet, just blocking light, taking resources, and also just weighing down the tree with an immense amount of plant matter. But the bittersweet is doing well, alive on that tree, and it similarly has overtaken shrubs to the right. This volunteer group removed almost all of it, and you can see from their removal work, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, who we partner with, was able to come in and get access to this tree trunk. And as I said, it was already dead, so they were able to cut it down. And this actually allows for a reduction of the seed bank of Oriental bittersweet, because it no longer has a place to grow up this tree. We're taking a massive amount of plant volume out of the park, and it's no longer able to distribute seeds from that location where they had previously been formed in the masses. So this was a project we were really proud of last year. To identify Oriental bittersweet, as I said, it is a vine, and it will range from a very small, flexible, soft green vine to what you see in this photo on the left, which is a thick woody vine. So as it matures, it grows to be more woody, and the diameter of the vine will also grow. We've seen some really large vines that are over 6 inches in diameter. So they get to be pretty massive and pretty heavy. So you can see why they might cause a tree to be so top heavy and even fall over. The leaves are a Kelly green. They are almost oblong or teardrop shaped, and they're also serrated on the edges. You could see in the photo on the bottom here, you could see that the best. They also have berries. This plant is popular actually for bouquets because the berries are so beautiful, particularly in the fall. They range from this green color to a yellow orange, and they are pretty, but they are very bad and spread quickly. One way to know for sure that you are removing Oriental bittersweet is to check the root system. It is extensive. It will be, if it's a large vine, the roots will be spreading for feet underground, sideways. But you'll know if you just look at a little bit. If it's orange, it is Oriental bittersweet. So when we are removing this plant from parks, the first step is to identify the plant. We spend time doing exactly what we just did, going over photos about what the vine might look like, what leaves look like, what the root looks like. So once we deploy volunteers in parks, we work in teams to identify the vine. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is as an individual or a household, if you are home and just wanting to remove bittersweet, gather together and try to see if you can identify it correctly. Then hand pull the vines. So if they're very small, fresh little sprout seedlings, you can actually just pull those with your hands. If they're a little bigger, you can cut the vines with loppers or pruners, and then work on either digging or pulling out the roots. We encourage you definitely to get as much of the root system as you can and remove as much of the seeds as you can. And when you are removing seeds, you will want to dispose of those properly. They cannot be composted or put, in a pile in the back of the yard if you have a big yard, as the seeds will spread the plant quickly. So for Mystic River Watershed Association, as I mentioned, we will not be deploying volunteers in large groups this season. So we are asking individuals or households to volunteer to remove bittersweet from McDonald Park in Medford. And if you would like to be one of these solo volunteers, there's a link on the screen right now. I will also put it in the chat function at the end of this webinar. But you can sign up to be one of our trusted solo volunteers using this poll. And we would ask you to visit the park bi-weekly from around mid-July through September. So that's maybe going to park 6 times to do your volunteer service. And we'll focus on really removing smaller plants just to maintain the work that we've been doing over the course of the past 3-4 years. We don't want these small seedlings to grow into large vines that are then both really hard to tackle next year and that will be able to produce a lot of seeds. We do ask that you take these plants home to dispose because we don't want any seeds to spread. And also DCR has very limited capacity right now while they're dealing with COVID-19. And so we won't ask them to remove piles of plants this year, which is also why we're focusing on just removing small seedlings. And these should be able to fit just into paper grocery bags. Lastly, be safe. We do want you to take precautions with COVID-19, observing proper physical distancing, wearing a mask, not going into parts of the park if they seem like there are a lot of people around. So definitely take your safety and health into primary consideration when doing this work. Tools that you might need, we have loppers, pruners, a hand trowel, gloves, and what's new this year, you'll want to bring your mask to the park and bring a bag so that you can take home plant matter to remove or dispose of properly. This year, we are also breaking McDonald Park down into several smaller zones. And these are parts of the park where we have worked on over the years that we really want to maintain, and also areas where bittersweet is most likely to appear. So if you sign up to be an individual volunteer, we will assign you to one of these sections, and we will probably break these down even further to make sure that they're taken care of and that we're able to engage as many people who want to volunteer with us this season. All right, so now I will go to the Q&A. I see one, which is how long does removed root remain viable for rerooting? That's a great question. I will have to look into this a little more to provide a more thorough answer. I would say in the summer, if you take the roots out and are able to dry them, I would think for even a week that should adequately kill them, but I'll follow up with you to double check. So there is a native variety of bittersweet. It's American bittersweet, but we don't have a lot of that actually in our area. What we tend to see, at least in McDonald Park, I've actually only seen Oriental bittersweet, and the best way to determine the difference is to look at the seed color, and I can't remember which one is native versus Oriental, but I can follow up with everyone on that as well. But for purposes of McDonald Park and our program, any bittersweet that you see is more likely than not going to be Oriental bittersweet, which is invasive. Okay. So the next question is, do we recommend disposing the plants in city yard waste, or would that spread it? I think it depends on what your municipality, how they dispose of it. If you can, if they are composting in a high heat facility it's hot enough to kill seeds, I think that is fine. But if it's just going to be put in a wood chipper, for instance, for mulch, that will spread the seeds. Next question is, do birds nest in bittersweet, and do they eat berries? Are the berries the seed? And yes, the bittersweet is it is a food for birds. So you know, that's one tricky thing when we're talking about invasive plants. You know, especially in a city, you might say, well, isn't some green better than no green, especially if it's supporting wildlife? But what we would like to see down the line is invasive plants removed and replaced with native plants to support our birds and insects. But to answer your question, birds will eat it and spread it, so it is important that we are removing as much of the seeds as we can. And in the case of McDonald Park, our goal is to then plant native plants that can support birds in the near future. Next question, is there a way to get volunteer hours, for example, for high school, for bittersweet removal? And this is definitely something that we can do. We will just have to work on a case-by-case basis, but we are happy to sign volunteer forms, etc., to make that happen. So someone says they're kayaking on the Mystic last year, and this last weekend, and the water chestnut has expanded a lot from last year across from Wegmans that we worked on this summer. The answer is yes, we will have a mechanical harvester in that part of the Mystic. One question, is there an opportunity in removing other invasives such as glossy buckthorn, garlic mustard, multiflora rose, English ivy, and others? Typically in a normal season, if we are out in McDonald Park and we are working with over 1,500 volunteers a season, we will get a bulk of the Oriental bittersweet, right? And so we will start to move to other invasive plants such as glossy buckthorn, garlic mustard, or black swallowwort, which is one I personally really despise. But we've decided to really go on a plant-by-plant basis and try to focus on ones that we think we can, that one are a big problem in the parks that we serve within the watershed, and also are ones that we might be able to actually make a measurable difference in containing. So for right now, we're focusing on bittersweet and water chestnut, hoping to replant with native plants in the next year or two in terms of McDonald Park or other areas. But looking at these other plants is certainly not off the table. When you're removing plants like glossy buckthorn or garlic mustard as well, you can definitely hand pull those and dispose of them in a similar way, either compost in a commercial facility where you have high heat, or put in the garbage to remove. So I have a great question about, is it possible to remove water chestnut while kayaking or canoeing in the Mystic? Answer is yes, definitely. The tricky part there is just where to dispose of it. If you were on your own or in a household and you just have, say, a basket worth of water chestnut, you can actually go to a part of the river where it looks like there are either trees or some land that isn't, for instance, a nice open space, but you can lay down the water chestnut in a very thin layer, and it will actually, if it's a sunny day in the summer, it'll actually kill the plant and the viable seed pods within a couple of days. So as long as they're not falling back in the river, you know, within a couple of hours, you should be fine just disposing of them that way. You can also, if you have a plastic bag with you, take them home and throw them away. But you certainly can do this on your own as well. It's just harder to get a large volume, right? But we would love for you to do that. Do water chestnuts occur in the same spot? The answer is typically yes. We will see patches of water chestnut reappearing in the same places each year. And if they are not contained, they spread seeds. Whether they are contained or not, we will spread seeds each year, unfortunately. And if these solo plants that pop up the next season are not contained, that becomes a new patch, and then we will see these seeds spreading, plants spreading exponentially year after year, which is why it's really important to maintain every year, even if we're just removing a few plants at a time. Another great question, what natives will be used to replant in place of bittersweet? That's something we are definitely going to have to do due diligence on, but we've talked about serviceberry or other plants that can potentially provide a little shade, provide habitat for wildlife, and also provide food for wildlife. But that's one that, again, we'll be doing more research on to figure out what's best for specific parks in the area and what we can adequately, effectively maintain. So I see another question, is there a way to point out bittersweet in the region that seems to be overtaking DCR property? Because there's a lot near Flynn Brink and Elm Street in Medford. Seems to be a lot of bittersweet and poison ivy. We could definitely pass this along to DCR. I know, again, particularly this year, their capacity is really low. And I would be a little apprehensive in a future year deploying volunteers if there's so much poison ivy, but we could see if there's a way for DCR to get out there and remove it. Are there any pitfalls to pulling water chestnut, for instance, getting out the whole root, etc.? So the thing you want to do when removing water chestnut is really getting that rosette of leaves, which has the seed pods attached to it. And we often encourage you to use the spaghetti method, which if you're imagining eating spaghetti, you have a long noodle and you're using the spoon to wrap it around and turning it to wrap it around the spoon or fork. And so when you're pulling a water chestnut plant, it's hard to do not on the water or to show you. But you can grab the plant and turn your hand over and over so that the roots wrap around your hand, because that root system might be 6, 10, 12 feet long. So you can get as much of it as you possibly can. That's great. But what's really most important when you're removing the plants is just making sure to get those leaves that have these seed pods attached to it. Someone says they've noticed trash bags in many areas of the park, and why were all the trash cans removed? And that was actually a DCR decision to remove trash cans during COVID-19, just because they don't have staff on board right now who are able to go by and actually maintain them and make sure they're being emptied. I believe that some of the trash cans in different parks have been set up again, but I don't think they are at still at full capacity to be able to maintain all of them. So is there a non-toxic way to kill the root system of bittersweet? That is a great question, and actually one that I don't know. I know for management of plants like Japanese knotweed or others that you do use chemicals on to maintain, those are in fact toxic and you need a special certification to use them. And I'm not aware of anything that is non-toxic at this time. I think that might be the end of the questions. Oh, I see one more. There are other grassy aquatic plants, so what are we doing about those? We are on the lookout for other invasive aquatic plants like milfoil, for instance. But at this time, as I said, with the land-based invasives, we're really focusing on one at a time, but we have alerted DCR, who helps maintain the river and has the contract with the mechanical harvester. They are aware that there are other invasive plants appearing in the river. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to put the link to volunteer in the chat. Ooh, if I can. I don't think I can, but if I'll leave this up so you can see and perhaps copy and paste if you would like to get that form to sign up. Oh, thank you. Someone put the link in the chat. So if you would like to volunteer, please use that to sign up. If you have additional questions, you're welcome to email me. My email is erica.wood@mysticriver.org. So questions, comments, concerns, happy to take those. Additionally, we will be doing another training, similar material later in the summer. So if you know someone who wanted to attend but missed this, just tell them to be on the lookout. Otherwise, I thank you again for attending and hope you have a great day. Thank you. Take care.